Legitimacy is absolutely essential to keep any person, institution, country, government, business going. And when it really boils down to it, it seems like a lot of what's going on in the area of competition is to build a legitimacy and take shots at it, you know, which is perfectly understandable. And in a situation where you choose your own leaders, the legitimacy from the point of view of the public is absolutely essential. No matter what you think of the public, no matter how you come to view them, which is not a permanent situation either. I've noticed, I didn't notice it when I was younger, but over time I started to see how the portrayal of the public has become less and less generous, to put it mildly, which has this kind of knockoff effect of also eroding legitimacy. Because if it's the common view of those who are elected or are managing things or in charge that the public is stupid, let's say, or not informed, then it completely calls into question the situation of legitimacy. Because you don't seek the legitimacy from a group of people who don't know any better. It's a completely different arrangement in that situation. So that's one of those kind of nuanced layers. But at any rate, the public and the view of the public and the view of people is absolutely essential, especially in time. It's easier and easier to find out information about things and about people. And if you're a weatherman, your legitimacy completely hinges on whether or not you get the weather right. And there's more or less different weights to your correctness or incorrectness. You can be correct 100 times about relatively minor things and be incorrect about something absolutely massive that has far more stakes, far more of a cost associated to it, and completely decimate your legitimacy. And that can take somebody out, that can really set a person back. Because that situation is something we kind of always have to keep up, And for some it's easier, for some it's more difficult. For myself personally, my legitimacy in this context completely hinges on whether or not I'm saying things that ring true. That's my whole game. But at work, my legitimacy hinges on whether or not I can cut things properly, fit them properly, measure them properly, and ultimately weld them in a way that doesn't result in broken welds and ill-fitting pieces of steel. And over time, this, let's say, being correct or doing well, builds up a kind of credibility. Because the continued building up of legitimacy has as a cast-off effect something like credibility. Michael Jordan would never have to say a single word. And he even said this a few times, all he has to do is play. And legitimacy is completely established. But in our situation here in the US and in other places, legitimacy, you need the people's support, obviously. And in a situation where, let's say, there was no cheating, no fixing, no lying, no misrepresentations whatsoever. And you had 100% support of the people, you are going to be feeling pretty comfortable in that situation. I mean, imagine complete, full, and total and utter support from the people. You're completely locked in at that point. But that's obviously never going to happen. I mean, and there's degrees there. There's fanatical supporters. There's people who will actually do work for you. They'll volunteer for you. They'll speak on your behalf. They'll defend you. They'll go to war for you. And then there's people who are kind of ambivalent, sort of supporters, but not really diehards. And then there's, obviously opposition. And the same would go for opposition. There are people who will oppose you vehemently and go out of their way to show up on the streets to show that opposition. But the U.S. is such a stable place. Actually, remarkably stable. And it's almost 250 years old, which is, a quarter of 1,000. Which is a pretty good run so far. And U.S. global legitimacy has come up in the last 40 years. And we have this interesting situation where you can have leadership, a presidency, a culture, an entire way of being for 8 years, 4 years, whatever. And then you can have somebody new come along and you have this interesting dynamic where the last 8 years, yes, it exists, and yes, it has a momentum, but all of a sudden there's something new that you have to deal with, hypothetically viewing it from the outside looking in. If you're somebody who has to deal with the United States on any basis, it is of primary concern to you who's going to be in charge. It's the most important thing to you. And to have to know that every 4 to 8 years you have a completely new person is kind of a daunting task to have to manage. I mean, if you have the same dude or chick for 40 years, things can get a little predictable. They can get intermeshed in a way that is relatively reliable. But from the outside looking in, if you're China or Russia, even Europe, South America, anywhere, you always have to know what the U.S. public is feeling. You always have to know the general climate of the people of the United States. You have to be able to prepare for what they want. Sometimes even more than you're concerned about what your own people want, which is kind of a strange situation. And it's a good one, because if we had it some other way, legitimacy would transfer away from the public if we had some other means. The fact that the public chooses the leaders makes legitimacy primary to the public, and all the nuances and finer details of their day-to-day lives and how they perceive their own country, their own people, their own everything. And being armed is an important element. I feel bad for other Western countries who have given way to losing their ability to harbor weapons, something as simple and basic as that. Almost every other Western country has completely lost that ability. And it has taken a huge shot at their legitimacy as a sovereign collection of people with a will of their own who choose leaders to enact that will. More and more often you see the desires, wishes, and needs of those people being completely incongruent with what actually happens. But in places like the UK, you can see pretty clearly that there's kind of a certain threshold, sort of a spillover point, where the legitimacy of your government is so weakened. The will of the people has completely deviated from the actions and intentions and movements of the government, that you kind of end up in a crisis scenario where you're worse than illegitimate. You're a joke. And that's worst case scenario for a leader, because legitimacy is one thing, but to be a complete joke is another. And you're on borrowed time at that point. You need the support of the people. You need the support of smaller collections of people in our day-to-day lives. Legitimacy is important. If you didn't have it, then you would hardly be able to speak on behalf of anything and have anybody take you seriously and listen to what you're saying. I mean, imagine if everything that you said went in one ear and out the other. That's no way to live. So, at least as some part of being legitimate in terms of what you think, you gotta be right. I mean, you have to be able to forecast with some ability, and that isn't necessarily about complex things, but all things. And you have to be honest. I mean, it's a huge undercut to your legitimacy if it's found out that you're lying. Massive. It can call into question all previous conclusions, decisions, and interpretations up until that point. That's the thing that ends up putting a spotlight on previous activities, is a single lie. And it doesn't sound like a big deal, but that's just the way it is. And you have to navigate the world with that in mind. It's not worth it, especially when you're dealing with people who are important to you, who matter, And everybody does on some level, but there's obviously degrees there. So, in the political game, you basically have to accuse your opposition of lying. You have to try to set back their legitimacy to the best of your ability without losing legitimacy yourself. Because there's a line there. You can't just say somebody's lying all the time, because what if they're not? What if everything that they've done and what they've said and reality as it unfolds is completely congruent with what they've been saying? You can't keep calling somebody this name or that name, or drawing this or that conclusion over and over, while reality bears out something else. That's how you erode your own legitimacy while trying to erode somebody else's. And you have to have some kind of self-awareness of that. I mean, at some point, like I said, you become a joke. You become worse than illegitimate. You become a laughingstock. When your name is heard or mentioned, people smile, snicker a little bit, Worse than illegitimate, a joke. Especially when your domain is serious things. Your whole domain is the direction of a nation, of a people. And in the United States, the biggest, strongest, most powerful place that's ever existed. And I'm not just saying that to, inflame us. It's true. So you're going to be losing your legitimacy here and regaining it there. And that this is the course. This is the way. This is how it goes. And it's the same in a game or a sport. You can win. You can have an amazing season. You can go without losing a single game. But if it's found out that if you were cheating, legitimacy is completely demolished, and now you have to defend yourself on this other plane. Instead of playing the game, instead of, doing what you do, now you have to be in this other domain, defending yourself in a way that could have been completely avoided. So for the most part, people don't really cheat, and if they do a really good job at not getting caught. And it's a massive scandal if you get caught, you know. And it's the same thing in a marriage because, generally speaking, it's understood that within a marriage, you're sort of, you have this one romantic partner for the rest of your life, you know. And if you cheat, there's a crisis of legitimacy. Of course there is. And if you lie, there's an erosion of legitimacy. Legitimacy and trust are highly linked. Trust is the thing that is built when there's a long line of recognized legitimacy. And that can carry you pretty far when you make mistakes, because we're all going to make mistakes. And I don't mean, you know, malicious mistakes. That can just completely take everything away. I mean normal, honest mistakes that will inevitably come, that take many, many forms, you know. And sometimes when you make an honest mistake, it can take the shape and figure of a malicious mistake. And in that situation, you have to basically persuade the parties involved that it was an honest mistake, not a malicious mistake. And there's a distinction. And we're doing that all the time in politics. There's this thing now where people think certain things are done intentionally. Intentionally. And there's this question of, is this happening on purpose, or is it an honest mistake? Essentially, the question is, are you dumb or evil? Which is kind of a tight spot to be in. But you have to have a situation where the truth is being said as much as possible. And people are hearing it as much as possible, and people are making decisions based on that as much as possible. Because introducing elements that are not true essentially adds entropy to the system. And certain systems have so much excess and so much built up legitimacy and so much built up trust. They can survive for quite a while with lies within them, and they can be repaired. But it's certainly better than it isn't to stay true. And when all else fails, force is there to establish legitimacy. But force doesn't establish legitimacy. It only creates the conditions to rebuild it. And you can't have a situation where force is the primary stabilizing force for too long, because it leads to instability inherently, because people know when things aren't fair, and force begets force. When force is used to maintain any sort of legitimacy for an extended period of time, it's going to grow that yearning that we all have for a free situation. Because we all understand things like justice and fairness as much as possible. There's a reasonability to fairness, you know. We understand that we are, yes, looking out for ourselves, but we have to look out for other people too. You can't just solely do one or the other, because it will slowly destroy one end or the other. If you're only ever looking out for somebody else, you'll give away too much, and you won't have enough to give. You'll stop generating. And if you're only looking out for yourself, you'll generate far too much and you'll take too much. So it's this kind of balance. But the U.S. is such a multi-layered entity of legitimacy. We export and we exist with such a wealth of ideas and motivations and different structures that any one of them having a bit of a crisis is nowhere near enough to be catastrophic. I mean, we live in a situation where just about anybody can become this sort of like king or queen, can become immensely powerful. The flow of goods and services and materials, talent, intelligence, all of these things able to establish legitimacy, coming together to create these huge, legitimate entities. And it's this place where one may think it's better to subdue, to curtail and limit and censor in the short term to benefit this entity or that entity, but in the long run, it's always better to let it go. It's always better to let and have people say what needs to be said, and then let somebody else say what needs to be said, and let it go and become finer and finer and better and better. And in romantic situations, legitimacy depends on mutuality, let's say. Because as I've said, one-sided love is just obsession. And the legitimacy has to be rooted in something that comes first and foremost from a feeling, because the way we feel isn't stupid. It's not so blind, but it is something that should be guided by rationale as well. They should go together. It shouldn't just be one or the other. We feel certain ways because there are parts of us that are able to take in massive amounts of information and put it all together as this sort of combined sum that is a feeling. The way you feel is so smart that it takes the rational mind quite some time to pull it apart and break it up into its parts and get to the root of what it actually is and why it is how it is. But the feeling is this colossus, and the rationale, the spotlight sort of logical mind is like a little blade that sort of carves away at it, makes sense of it. Because what we end up feeling ends up being part of this totality from the things that we experience every single day. So the way you feel, that's why we ask that way. How do you feel about this or that? And it's up to a person right then and there to take that spotlight and move it across that feeling and find the words that are best for that context, for that exact question. But that feeling is so vast, so able to be interpreted, that you could put endless words to it to represent it, because it's constantly changing too. And legitimacy is a precondition for, let's say, certain positive feelings to exist. When somebody is accused of a crime, the legitimacy of their guilt is a extension of thoroughness, of detail. And you need a jury to listen to it, take it into consideration, and to give a verdict. And sometimes in real time, you have all that information from the case, but they're also looking at the accused sitting right there, and that stuff matters, man. There have been people on juries who have listened to a very, very compelling case. I mean, very compelling, to where an outside observer would probably say that dude's guilty, you know, pretty overwhelmingly. And have been jurors who have said, you know, I just couldn't see him doing it, you know. He reminded me of my son. Or I just couldn't see it. Just by the way that person presented themselves every day. And it's incredibly complex on a day-to-day basis because we as people, we are aware of what is true, and we are also aware of what should be true to establish legitimacy or trust or to establish innocence. We are acutely aware. And it is when a person approaches you, a new person, if they've spent a great deal of time manufacturing legitimacy or manufacturing their image, there's a good chance you'll be able to pick up a little something in between the lines. And this isn't a statement of paranoia. It's borne itself out more than it hasn't. Because legitimacy is it's like a ship floating on the water. If there's a single hole in the hull, water's going to get in. And solid legitimacy doesn't have any holes. It stays floating, it can navigate, it stays at health, it goes and it goes for years. But people who approach you in that way seem to have more than one hole, you know, maybe multiple holes. And they're always trying to spend energy plugging those holes up because they aren't operating from a position that has been a proven, tried, and tested situation of legitimate operation, let's say. And it just seems obvious, you know, it just seems like a business or anything, a government, anything that operates that way has these little tells, like these little giveaways, you know, that are almost bellwethers of their lack of legitimacy. And that's not to say that casting a certain image, manufacturing this or that image is necessarily always a bad thing, because as people, you know, it's kind of going to come and go a little bit. But I think it depends more on very heavy incongruencies between what one does and what one says one does. The larger and more consistent those incongruencies, the more a person has to, what amounts to, waste energy on patching up these holes and how they actually exist in the present, which is probably exhausting, I would imagine. But nobody wants to end up in that situation where you're supposed to be doing this thing, and it comes to light that you are not who you say you are. I mean, that's actually like one of the worst things that can happen to a person. And I think that's why this day and age we regard the word authenticity so highly, because it's happened over and over again, you know. But it doesn't so much erode our sense of, I don't want to say optimism, but our sense of the ability to trust. It doesn't erode it so much that it's completely dominant in our worldview. At least it doesn't for me. No matter how many times I see people destroy their legitimacy or live in this way that is highly incongruent with what they say, no matter how many times I see that, it doesn't actually ever officially begin to dominate how I see the world, you know, because I expect that, you know. it's natural that there's a range of people. And I've noticed through life there are people whose thoughts and opinions I view as more important, you know, or even opinions who I value even more, you know. And of course that's gonna, I guess, depend on the context and the situation. I mean, you don't want just anybody teaching you about history. I mean, what if they don't know anything about history? It's nice to have a historian, and that adds a sense of legitimacy to what they're saying, because you don't want to be in that context in a classroom, right, taking notes, preparing for tests with somebody who just walked up and has no idea what they're talking about. And it's similar with people too in the world, because people are going to approach you with ways of existing themselves that end up fitting different roles in your life. And there's that situation that I have seen a couple of times, but every time I see it, I think, man, that's gotta suck. And it's that situation where somebody is adopted, you know, and they live for quite a number of years with that family, with those parents, believing wholeheartedly that these are their true parents, and they end up finding out somehow, usually through not the best means, that this is not their real family. And I imagine what that must do in that moment to your sense of everything, really. And it sets people off on a quest, because people want to know, they want to be able to see and touch and feel where they came from, because there's no more direct route to your sense of comprehending the world and yourself in the present than seeing your parents and how they exist. Not to say that your parents and how they exist is so defining that it's everything, but it certainly answers some questions. And there is something in us that would probably stop at very few things to figure that out. And there's also the appearance of being true and real and strong. There are places now whose militaries spend more time appearing strong than actually being strong. And that blow to legitimacy is massive. Like, the US military is almost mythologically strong. You know, the US military has that myth that, you know, what they show us is incredibly potent, but imagine what they don't show us. You know, it kind of has this myth that it's this all-powerful force, which is true, which adds some serious legitimacy to just the United States as an entity. Having this mythical force that is global. But some things that exist now, it's like strange that it even exists. The fact that the United States exists as it does is such an anomaly. And I think it's important that people know the anomaly that it is. That it actually is a special situation. And it is that way both because of geography, but also because of the institutions, the facilitating laws and rules that exist as they are. But it's actually gotten to a point, I would say, where it's a bit too much. We could trim some stuff here and there. We could be a hell of a lot smarter here and there with how we word certain things. But on the whole, it's a place where, honestly, just about anything is legitimately possible. It's like when we hear these stories about these people who start from nothing and end up with everything. I mean, it's just another notch on the belt of legitimacy. every time you hear a story like that, you think to yourself, it actually becomes normal, to the point where it can kind of be taken for granted, I remember when I was younger, I thought things were so much more difficult than they actually turned out to be. With time, the perception of difficulty in the world shed itself more and more and more, to where it actually isn't that difficult. If you want to do something, that you can actually do it, And if you don't get it done the first time, you can do it again. And it's weird too how hearing stories of certain people who have failed catastrophically, I mean worse than failed, ended up going completely the other way in time and just blowing everything out of the water, becoming utterly fantastic. And through all of that, one of the most important things, is the sense the public has of governmental and political legitimacy. It's such a vital thing here in the U.S. and anywhere else, and it's so stable here, and we're so used to it that it's easy to forget how important it is, because we wake up every day and we do our thing and we live our lives, and we just, even having that ability to have such a routine, well-honed, desirable existence is a fruit of the deep legitimacy that this place is and has. And stability is a symptom of that as well. I mean, we have these amazing sports, this amazing entertainment. You can go just about anywhere, buy just about anything you want. And in the creative direction, there's more than likely a material for you that you can use to make whatever you want. And honestly, it's pretty great, And we actually, in my opinion, I think we should see how far we can take that, And I've said that multiple times, but that's sort of that would be my pitch. If I were to run for office, I would say, everybody has their slogan. Mine would be, let's see how far we can go. Something like that. Because I am aware of negative things. I'm aware of negative possibilities, negative outcomes, negative this, negative that. But my brain doesn't seem to hold on to or stick to those interpretations. It always seems there's a general air of optimism. And when shitty things happened, and they have happened, it sucks, but it doesn't stick. Bad things just don't seem to stick. It's almost like there's too much good in general that's been built up for bad to stick. It's almost like it's just not enough to officially move my internal sense of how things are. And for some other people, it's the exact opposite. For some other people, no matter how many good things happen, their sense of terrible is never quite changed as well. Because things have a momentum like that. Like I said in the past, there's a connection between motion and emotion, and it builds and builds and builds and collects. And it tends to go in one of two directions. And over time, it builds into a feeling. And a feeling is not very different from the speed, direction, and quality of motion. And it's hard to stop something that's moving fast and that is heavy. It's very hard, but that's how it goes. Some things take longer than others. But for us, for all of time, so long as there is people, it is their support that is the most important thing, because no matter how hard or often an entity or person tries to artificially sustain legitimacy, it's always going to fall against people simply talking amongst each other. If there are polls that come out day after day that say so-and-so has 90% support, and over time you go through your day-to-day life finding no such support, it's only a matter of time. And that's the way it's always going to go, unless something dramatic happens. So long as there is people, it's always going to boil down to their day-to-day experience and their daily sentiments and the overall feeling. Doesn't matter what you put out, doesn't matter how often something is said, there is a huge congruence between competence and legitimacy as well. If you're always saying that there is plenty and there's never enough, then it's only a matter of time. But results and competence speak for themselves. Like I was saying, Jordan doesn't really have to say anything. He could, and he might actually say something that takes away from his legitimacy. But the fact of the matter is, we all watched what he did. And the direction we're going now, we're going to install different things. We're going to have new things. We're going to have artificial intelligence as well. But the legitimacy of artificial intelligence is also going to be bound by the same rules and patterns that we are with legitimacy. It can't be completely incompetent. It can't be wrong over and over. It can't use force for any extended period of time. All these things will erode legitimacy. And the truth always finds its way.